Okay.
This was from a paper in the 50s. I think we talked about.
When was it Robert Remes who came up with science fiction? When was that? Like, I'm thinking. Okay. Okay. So this has been around for a while, but in the scheme of how long people have been using speech and language, it's incredibly recent. Okay, so I don't know about you, but to me this just sounds like some weird woobly, bird songy, R2D2y, I don't know. Okay? Right. Okay. So, okay. Now, I'm going to play you a different sound that will have some interesting relation to that one.
She cuts with her knife. She cuts with her knife.
Can you guys all hear that okay? So, what is that? What is the person saying? This is not a trick question.
She cuts with a knife.
She cut with a knife. Okay, so some guy with a kind of, even posher English accent than me saying she cut with a knife.
She cuts with her knife.
Okay? Okay, now I'm going to play that weird bird-songy thing again. Okay? This is, by the way, from the webpage of this guy called Chris Darwin. He didn't invent silent speech, but he has nice demos and he's done some interesting work. Okay, so here's the weird thing again. Okay, because it's not really loud, can you hear now? Does this sound a little different now? Is there anyone, can anyone not hear something kind of speechy in now? Like, especially if you imagine, remember, like you're hearing the guy saying she cut with her knife, okay? And now just kind of, can you hear that actually kind of hiding inside it, there's someone saying she cut with her knife? Even though the first time you heard it, it just sounded like this most weirdo kind of whistly stuff. Okay, so what on earth is going on there? So, so this is an illustration of there being some kind of interesting weird stuff in speech. By the way, I played this demo in Florence class. It worked a bit better because it was over loudspeakers, and it was like a room full of 100 undergrads or something. And when I played like the woobly thing the second time after they'd heard she cut with a knife, like the whole room sort of went like, oh, like that. And I was like, oh, that's so gratifying, But so none of you guys sort of like gasped in awe, but that's okay. Okay, so so formants. Okay, formants are, so this is, if you look at just like a plain old recording of speech, it kind of looks like this, right? It's just like this woobly line going up and down, and the louder it is, the bigger this wooble is. Okay. And if you just sort of draw a picture of, what's the peak woobliness, then it would look something like this. This is the technical term, this would be like the amplitude envelope. So that's kind of, how much noise is hitting your ear. But there's a very interesting thing that you can't actually see when it's just plotted like this, which is that, if you kind of zoom in really closely on this is all kinds of little waves going up and down. And you can actually represent any wave going up and down as a sum of lots of different waves of different frequencies. And that's called the Fourier spectrum of, you can do that with sound, you can do it actually with visual images, you can do it with lots of things. That's actually how MRI works as well. There's a whole separate story. Anyway, it's a powerful tool. And so this here is a plot of time going this way. I don't know if can you see my mouse wiggling? Okay. And this here is the frequency, so, like just how high pitched the thing is. So, if you play piano or something, then the note A would be here or something. So this is kind of really, really high pitch up here, and this is more like the kind of pitch that you could sing at down here. And you can sort of see a little bit here. It'll be clear in some other pictures that there's kind of some pictures of which there's a little bit. There's more black stuff, so there's more power. There's literally more loudness happening at those frequencies. Okay. And if you zoom in a little bit, now they've actually drawn, this green doesn't show up super well, but they've drawn green lines over these sort of peaks in loudness, peaks in this is called the spectrum going up this way, because it's like a spectrum of colors is a range of different frequencies of light, and this is a range of different frequencies of sound, so that's why they call it spectrum. And so these peaks in the frequency spectrum are called formants, and they sort of go up and down, and the way they go up and down is actually contains a lot of information about what's being said. So here they've zoomed in even more, and now you can see there's even like succession of bands. So you've got like the first band, that's called the 0th peak or the fundamental frequency. That's basically how high pitch is your voice. You know, are you like a man or a woman or a young child, something like that. And then you've got the second one, third one, and the way they go up and down contains a lot of information about what you're saying. Okay, so this is called like formant trajectories. Now, what was going on in that weirdo woobly speech that she cut with her knife? That's called sine wave speech. Okay, so what they actually did was, if you take this, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the signal, but if you take it and you reduce it to nothing but just pure tone, so a pure tone is a sine wave, right, like la. But if you take that pure tone, you make it, you know, so in this case, so here they're sort of starting off higher and going down a bit, so it'd be sort of like, right, okay? So if you take these pure tones and you just make those pure sine wave tones follow these contours, so you have nothing but those tones, you don't have any of the reverberation, any of these higher stuff going on, okay? Then you end up with that woobly stuff, so you've just stripped speech down to its pure sine waves, so that's why it's called sine wave speech. And when you first hear it, it doesn't sound like speech at all, because you've cut out a lot of the things that make it sound speechy. But then when you hear it again, especially if you've been primed with what the actual speech sounds like, you can actually kind of tell that someone's saying she cut with her knife, and there's other demos on that page too. And that's because this crucial information is still there. And this is actually kind of very useful, interesting cognitive science trick in general, right? You sort of try and cut away, and get things as simple as they possibly can be, but not simpler, such that some of the key information is still there. And that sometimes is a useful way of kind of trying to figure out what that key information is doing. Although it always comes at a cost. It comes at the cost that you're left with something that seems really unnatural. There's a lot of debate, and it's partly a matter of taste. Some people love using really natural stimuli, and some people love using really simple stimuli, and each has its pros and cons. Okay, so and you know, we talk with their mouths. And in fact, there's all kinds of different bits in your mouth, and the way in which they make speech is very interesting, and I'm going to skip that. But what I really wanted to show you was what these formants are. Okay, so yes, hey, Donis, excellent.
Is that experiment being tested with the subject, with the language that the subject doesn't speak or doesn't understand?
Very, very, very good question. Excellent. So one of the many, many debates in this area is, okay, these things, you know, these things that carry the really speechy information, right? The formants, okay? They're literally acoustic things going up and down, right? But are they really just sounds, you know, or are they sort of like special speech-imbued sounds that maybe like get processed in a different kind of way, okay? So there's in fact ways of presenting these things. They call it like duplex speech is one version, where you sometimes hear them, you might hear the exact same thing, but you sometimes hear them as speech and you sometimes hear them just as sounds. Okay, in fact, actually, I kind of did that to you just in that demo, right? That when you first heard actually duplex speech is not quite that. Okay, ignore, pretend I didn't say that, sorry. You know, when you first heard it, the same thing was hitting your eardrums, but it just sounded like woobly, you know, woobly woobles, okay? That's the technical thing. So you were listening to that as an acoustic stimulus, and although it happened to be in English, you didn't even know it was in English. It could have been in, you know, Mongolian for all you knew, okay? So that was kind of a little bit like this instance of I tried to pick a language that I'm guessing nobody in this room speaks. I don't even know if that is a language, actually, but between you guys, you speak a lot of languages, so maybe, yeah, is Mongolian a language? I should know that. So when you first heard that, you were kind of listening to it in a non-speechy way, and the third time you heard it, you were listening to it in a speechy way, but the exact same thing was hitting your eardrums. Okay, so your brain was certainly processing it differently because you perceived it differently, in fact, actually, people have done that study actually, and they've shown that there's differences in activation, but you know, I'm not sure if people have done a decoding version of that, but that would be interesting actually. But you know, of course there's going to be some differences in activation because you're perceiving it as differently, but you know, how is this information being processed differently? That's probably still an open question. I think that is an open question. So yeah, so it really does make a difference whether you're listening to this and thinking, aha, that's a language that I understand, or whether you're listening to it and just saying, yeah, that's some sounds hitting my eardrums. So that's a very excellent question. And in fact, there's an entire stream of research in speech in which people systematically vary the intelligibility of speech and make it, sound really garbled or a bit less garbled, or, still somewhat garbled, but now you can actually understand what they're saying. And people look at how this affects different areas. In fact, Sophie Scott, who's a big person in this area, has done a lot of those studies. So these are very, very good and interesting questions. And yes?
Sort of like when you repeat a word too many times and it ends up sounding weird. Is that like the reverse?
That's very interesting as well. And so if you're into like websites that have cool sound demos on them, so this guy called Richard Warren, who came up with, is Richard Warren still alive? I don't know. Anyway, his stuff, his demos are on the web, possibly not put there by him. He came up with many very interesting auditory illusions of that kind, and some of them actually are kind of, a bit mind-blowing. And one of them is this example of you hear the same sound looped over and over, and it starts to like, it's very hard to describe. You've probably listened to this kind of demo, right? Oh, okay. Well, I recommend listening to this demo. It's very weird, because you know that it's the same sound hearing over. I'll see if I can find the link and send it to everyone. But you'll probably be able to find it.
I think I have one too.
But there's definitely demos of this sort on the web. You hear literally the same sound looped over and over, and it starts to just kind of dance in your mind. It starts to sound like it's changing all the time. It starts to flip between different kinds of ways of hearing it. It's very interesting. People have studied that a bit, but I think it's probably fair to say people don't quite understand what's going on there. It's certainly related, although what the relation is, probably under debate. Okay, so there's another, before I get to just showing you some brain stuff, many of you have probably encountered categorical perception in some shape or form. If you haven't, that's fine, because that's what this class is for, in part. Just out of interest. Okay, now this is a good one. So sometimes there come times where people actually don't really want to stick their hand up and say, I've never heard of categorical perception before. So I was actually talked by someone once, Tom Griffiths actually, and he has a nice way of allowing people to kind of express something, but without their neighbors being able to really tell that they're doing it, which is that you hum. Okay, because you can't really tell by looking at someone with the hum. Okay, so if you've never encountered, if you don't know what categorical perception, okay, that's fine. Oh, okay, well you can stick your hand up too. That's fine. But you could also do it by hum. Okay, well that's fine. Well, there's no shame in that whatsoever. So that's good. Okay, so let me tell you what categorical perception is, and this is also, one of the. This is on the theme of the stuff that speech is built out of, which, having now that armed with the knowledge that it's built out of this, we can start to ask, well, how might the brain be doing this? But it turns out it's not just speech that has this. In fact, this is common to almost all aspects of perception. So this is actually a very, very important phenomenon. People often say, for instance, of say politicians or human beings in general, oh, they don't see the nuances and subtleties in the world. They see everything in black and white. They don't see the shades of gray. Okay? And there's many times where failing to see the nuances and just seeing things in terms of black and white means that you miss a lot of important stuff that's going on in the world. But there is actually one big advantage to seeing things in black and white, is it's quick and it gives you a good answer, a good fast answer, straight away. Okay? So if you only have 50 milliseconds to decide whether the person who's coming towards you looks like they're angry or happy, which actually especially if you were a caveman or something, your life might depend upon it. You want to decide really fast what's their facial expression before you get too much into the nuance of just exactly how angry or smiley do they look. Okay, which in many other circumstances would be an interesting question, but right now you're just like, should I run or should I not run? Well, if you're so that in fact people do have categorical perception of facial expressions. Okay, so in speech, so those of you who went to Dave Kleinschmidt's talk, he showed that when you're trying to hear, for instance, if something is ba or da, there's a loads of different ways in which people can say ba and da. Okay, it varies from person to person. It varies within a person. Now usually you don't actually really care, just exactly how typical was their utterance of ba just now. You just want to know what word they're saying to you, right? You want to know whether they're saying bad or dad, right? Now, there are other times in which you might be interested in exactly, how pure was their phonetic utterance and how typical was it and stuff like that. But most of the time, you're just like, yeah, what did they say? And they're shooting words at me at many words per second. I don't have time to dwell on this. I just want to quickly know what they said and move on. Okay? So at times like that, perceiving the world in black and white can actually be quite useful. And that's what categorical perception is. Okay? So if you take, in like Dave's graphs that he showed, there's like this whole kind of continuum of different ways in which you can make a particular sound. Okay? And in fact, actually, I sort of showed that in some of the graphs before. So this along here, the x-axis, is a continuum of different ways in which you can make a sound that at this end sounds really purely ba-ish, and at this end sounds really purely da-ish, and in the middle is some kind of weird mixture. Okay? And on the y-axis here is how often people actually say, yeah, that sounds like a da, or yeah, that sounds like a ba. Okay? And what you'll notice is that this thing looks more or less like a step function. Not a completely perfectly vertically steep step function, but it's pretty steppy. Okay? It's certainly not a perfectly, smooth, continuous diagonal line. So if people's degree of saying, yeah, that sounds like ba, yeah, that sounds like da, was tightly linked to what was the actual acoustic thing hitting their eardrums, then their response would look like a kind of smooth, continuous, straight line like this. But that's not what their response is. That would be like hearing the world in shades of grey. Okay? But in fact, they sort of hear it in black and white, more or less. Okay? So that's great. That means that, and categorical perception happens a lot. Okay? And by the way, categorical perception, kind of just happens, not just in our brains, it kind of happens in the world too, right? Like if you've got, you've got you're playing a game of tennis and you've got a net in the middle of the court, right? And I don't actually play tennis, but, and you're serving the ball, and sometimes it goes cleanly over the net, and sometimes it sort of, goes into net, and sometimes it sort of, hovers on the middle and might fall on one side and might fall on the other, right? It's always going to fall on one side or the other, okay? So in a sense, that net is a categorical perceiver of ball position, right? And if you didn't have the net there, you'd have a much tougher job of figuring out, which side of the court did the ball land, because the thing's moving really fast. Okay? So you can actually get something like categorical perception from a very simple mechanism, but that's not to say that we have something like that in our heads, but it just takes some big continuous space and just divides it into two things. Now the advantage of that is that you get a nice, clean, quick, simple answer out. The disadvantage is that you become awfully insensitive to the subtleties on either side of the border, right? So you might know that the ball landed in my side of the court or the other person's side of the court, but you may not know where in the court did it land, okay? And which, from the point of view of was your server okay, doesn't actually matter. So if you present little pairs of sounds that are separated by, in this case, like 3 steps here, okay, the pairs might straddle this boundary, and in which case one will sound like ba and one will sound like da, and you'll be super sensitive at telling the difference between those 2 pairs. So in fact, this here is a kind of showing pairs that straddle, that are a certain number of steps apart, constant number of steps apart, and this here is how often could people tell the difference between them. And when they're in the middle and they straddle the boundary, people are very sensitive, they can totally tell the difference. But when both sounds are in the same category, so they don't straddle the boundary, people are like, yeah, they sound the same to me. One sounds like ba, the other sounds like ba. I don't even know if they're different bars or not, they sound the same. Okay? So that's kind of the cost of categorical perception. But evolution has decided that for many types of categorization, that cost is totally worth it. Right? So we perceive things categorically. Okay, I'm going to skip this a little bit. Okay, so now let's get to some neural stuff, and then we'll take a little break, and then we can chat a bit more. Or maybe we should take a break. Do people want to take a break in like 10 minutes, or do people want to take a break now? Okay, let's talk. I'm going to quickly show you some neural stuff. Okay, so here's an example of categorical perception and not having categorical perception. Okay, so we in native English speakers, and I know not everyone here is a native English speaker, but if you're a native English speaker, then you can hear the difference between ra and la. Okay, but if you speak an East Asian language such as Chinese or Japanese, then you probably have much more difficulty hearing the sound between ra and la. And the reason is because when you're a baby growing up, you just weren't really exposed to instances of those two sounds actually having different meanings and requiring different responses for you, and you just, that wasn't something that you were kind of bathed in as you were growing up. Whereas if you're a native English speaker, there's lots of sounds in other languages that you wouldn't be able to hear. Okay, so for instance, my wife's from Bangladesh. I'm trying to learn Bengali. It's kind of similar in Hindi. You speak Hindi, is that right? Yeah. Okay. There's like about at least 4 different ways of saying ta, for instance. Okay, and I have terrible difficulty hearing the difference between those.
I've tried that on some friends, like with the na sound, like people just can't tell. And
Exactly.
Like, okay, I'm saying it differently.
Yeah,
Look at
yeah.
my
And
tongue
they're
is
like,
moving
why are you
differently.
repeating yourself? And they're like, no, I'm not
I'm
repeating
like,
myself.
look at my tongue, it's different.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
even when they're seeing it, they can't really tell the difference.
Right, right, exactly. And I'm not sure, but there's probably some English language sounds that are a little bit, conversely kind of difficult for you, maybe like ba versus va or something like that, maybe. I'm not sure. But for Japanese and Chinese speakers, ra versus la is difficult. So in a certain sense, you might say that, we're learning disabled at hearing the different types of, labial and dental tas and das in Hindi, and because we didn't just get exposed to that when we were growing up, and they're in a certain sense sort of learning disabled at hearing like ra versus la. And so what does this have to do with categorical perception? Well, because we divide, so here's like these different formants. So this is why I could have went to the trouble of telling you what formants were, and, their role in perceiving categories. So in this case, for this particular contrast, the second and third formant, so the second and third peak in their frequency spectrum are very important. In fact, actually the third one does almost all the work. So for English speakers, as you go from like and the kind of abbreviation for third formant is F3. So if you go from a low third formant to a high third formant, all of a sudden you change category. You go from this green thing which sounds like ra to this yellow thing that sounds like la. And because you've changed category, you're super sensitive to that difference. Okay? Well, if you're a Japanese speaker, it doesn't really matter where you are on this axis. It's all just one big lumpy category, and so you're much less sensitive to that difference. Okay, so, and in fact, if you actually just plot people's behavioral responses, so this is just a measure of their behavioral sensitivity, and this is just saying the same thing. English people are really sensitive to this difference in the third formant, not as sensitive to a difference in the second formant, which is going in this direction. That, for most places here, you can change in this direction, and you're still green or you're still yellow. There's a couple of places where it maybe changes, but not much. Okay, and Japanese speakers are not really sensitive in either direction because it's just green all the way. Okay, you don't change category. Yeah.
So is that because? So I guess I'm kind of having a difficult time wrapping my head around that. Is that because the second and third formant do not preferentially convey more information than the other, and in English it does?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So in Japanese, there just are not pairs of sounds which have different meanings, and the thing that makes them have different meanings is their difference along this dimension.
Right.
This is just a dimension that just doesn't do work in Japanese. Okay, just as there's this dimension of like the slightly different positions of your tongue placement when you're saying ta, that does a lot of work in Hindi but does not really any work in English, and so we just can't hear it. Interestingly, up till about age 6 months, babies are actually more or less equally sensitive to these different distinctions, and they sort of lose the distinction. In fact, Pat Cool and Janet Worker and other people showed this. They lose that distinction between sort of 6 to 9 months for the languages that they're not exposed to, and they get more sensitive to the distinctions that matter for the language that they are exposed to, and in fact, the degree to which they do that is even predictive of their language development later in life. So it's totally a function of whether these distinctions kind of did any work in the language that you learned when you were a kid, basically.
So, sort of a super naive question. Is there any sort of physical basis for that? Like, do we use our tongues and mouths and throat to articulate differently, or?
That's a very, very good question. And I just want to say, I know I said this before, every time if you ever find yourself thinking, this is probably a stupid question, it's probably a naive question, that actually probably means it's a really good question, probably, okay? Because, 2 reasons. First of all, it probably means it's getting to something fairly fundamental. And second of all, this is cognitive neuroscience. It's not the case where everyone just knows the answers to the fundamental questions. Every question is open from like the minute you walk in the door, right? Which is exciting and frustrating at the same time. So what's physically different? That's a very interesting question. I don't completely know the answer to that. So certainly there's differences and not only I don't know if anyone, I mean, the human race probably doesn't know the answer to that, but I even more so don't know the answer to that. So,
I mean, Dick was asking this question. I don't know if it's in the same context.
Yeah, so,
At Dave's talk.
right, so there's, see if I can say this without getting into something complicated.
Yeah.
There's a really, I don't know this literature very well, but there's a really interesting area open for people to look at for the following reasons. And this, I'll just do this really, really quickly. So it used to be the case that people believed that kind of infants got the sound system of their languages, the language, and then they started learning words.
Yeah.
And one of the things that has come out recently, and one of the people who did this work most convincingly is Elika Bergelson, who's a postdoc at Dick's lab, is that in fact, kids are learning words as early as 6 months, and the development of the phonological system and learning word meanings are interleaved with one another in really interesting ways, so that some of the very fine-grained distinctions are showing up much later than a certain amount of word learning. Now, why is that at all relevant to this? So you can ask, well, what happens if you're not exposed early on to differences between what L's and W's? Okay, so one story becomes you have a system that has stopped being plastic, right? Because it essentially has categorized pretty rigidly. And it's very, very hard to learn. It's very hard to teach. I mean, that's what Dick was raising at the end of Dave's talk. But there's another possibility, which says that the reason that you don't learn very well is that now you have to ask, how often would somebody encounter, say, a Japanese speaker encounter distinctions where it would make a lexical difference that they couldn't figure out from context or from their word knowledge, in which case it would be, if you're like learning, it would be a very hard learning problem, because it's much easier to attribute, right, to just explain what, the ambiguity in the signal in terms of this other information you have. And so, of course, when you try to give forced choice based on this distinction that is independent of actual words,
Right.
but is just the sound difference at syllable levels,
Right.
it's really, really hard to learn that,
Right.
because not only have they not learned that distinction, but they've learned that to carve up that space by attributing to, bringing in other kinds of stuff.
Right.
And so and that kind of way of thinking about it is a little bit more consistent with like how would you get categorical perception out of the system, like what Dave was talking about, given there are two categories. You have to know there are two categories, but then how you're going to group things. And so if you come from that perspective and now start asking these questions that Raj was bringing up, then you could well imagine a line of research that says, hey, here's a different angle on this. And maybe it changes the way you think about it, maybe it doesn't. But these ways of thinking about it are ways that were not percolated into the way that people looked at these kinds of questions.
That is very interesting.
And one thing that I don't want to take up all the time, but
this is great. Discussion is extremely welcome.
I in hearing Dave's talk, it's really nice, but it's like, to what degree, how does co-articulation, given that, we don't speak phonemes individually, right? So how does that, as you say, sort of carve up, how does that, so given that the raw distinction is very difficult, but, like you say, you sort of bring to the table all this top-down information, like the words and the context in which that's involved, and so do, for instance, Japanese speakers fall apart when you have, so...
Yeah, so the question you're asking, the way I would answer, I mean, you're asking a really hard question.
Yeah.
But the question you're asking ties into something that Dave brought up very early in his talk, where
the different levels,
where he said it's computationally, one thing that makes this computationally tractable in a really nice way is to say we're going to divide up these different levels, okay, and But then, when you see what speech is like,
Right.
you get all these cases where information at one level can be very informative at another level. So, for instance, just based on if I said the lamp at the beginning of the vowel, you would have a pretty good idea that I'm going to say like a semivowel, and you have a pretty good idea which one, based on the co-articulatory information. Now, what about co-articulatory information versus certain sounds like L and W and M and R? Well, it turns out that they are very similar in some respects, so they're similar.
I see.
Yeah. So you run into these questions about, okay, now when you're trying to figure out how the system might explain different types of the data, and would it be best to rely just on these lower level type signals, or would you want to have these other expectations? I mean, this is like territory that has just started to get sharpened because people like Dave and Florian and so on are working with these kinds of computational models that shift the search space a little bit, so that some of these classic issues get you start thinking about it in somewhat different ways and challenge different assumptions. So the answer is, I think, to a large extent, one we don't know because people have mischaracterized aspects of the problem. So we need territory.
Well, that is super interesting, and I think it's probably. I mean, Mike gave 2 examples of studies that sort of, well, not to this exact issue, but sort of talk to these issues. And it's probably a true statement. You could probably literally count on one hand and still have some fingers left the number of brain studies that actually really speak to these issues. And we collectively, I would certainly love to do it. Could fill up a couple more fingers on that hand in a very worthwhile way. The only thing I'm just going to ask is, can you give everyone just for the didactic benefit, just an illustration of co-articulation, just in case there's probably some, just to tell people what it is.
Sorry, actually.
No, that's fine.
So, so this is a case where I can give you. Let me give you 2 examples. One which you won't hear very easily, and one which I think, if I get it right, you can actually feel with your tongue. So if I said the lamp versus the fish, what you would actually see is, because of the different tongue positions, as you were starting to say the vowel, you would actually say the vowel in a different way because your tongue is getting ready to move into the position.
So the part of the
versus a the.
Yeah.
Okay. So the case you could probably feel is if I said, let me get this. Okay. Let's take tape and cape. Okay, those 2 sounds, tape and cape. And now we're going to say Christmas tape. Just kind of say it yourself, Christmas tape. Okay, and now foolish tape. And what you'll find is when it is foolish tape, that your tongue doesn't get as far forward on the T sound because you started from the back. Now, if we then said Christmas cape and foolish cape, then you'd actually find that where your tongue got for the T in one case was where you got for the K in the other. Because if you're having to come from the far back and go front, you don't get all the way there. So that's the case of the sound that you have said. That's a kind of backwards case. The first case I gave you was anticipatory, where how you're saying the preceding sound is being modulated by what comes next. Here, how you're saying the sound that's upcoming is influenced by where you were. So if you started in front of the mouth and getting to a T, like s to t, you're in the same location. If you have to go from s to k, that's going way back. And if you're speaking quickly, you won't get all the way back there. But your perceptual system kind of compensates for that.
That's great. Thank you so much. You know, I've actually always wanted to have like a nice example of like what to say. You know, what would be a pair of sounds to say for co-articulation. So Christmas tape and foolish tape. Your tongue is in a very different position when you say the t. Okay.
So there are two parts that make that neat. One is you can feel what happens to the t and the cut. So that's one part, depending on whether you have. So if you have Christmas cake, you don't get as far back as if you said foolish cake. But the other thing is that the T and the K can overlap,
That's nice.
between where you end up in sort of the articulatory space. And so what would look like it if you just took it in isolation? What would look like? You actually shift the TK boundary, and that's kind of a classic
very nice.
example where people have fought over the mechanism.
And would it be fair to say that not only, you know, when you're saying tape preceded by Christmas or foolish, is your tongue in a different place, but also the waveform that's going to hit your listener's ear will be quite different, even though they'll, without even noticing, just say, yeah, they just said tape. But
Yep.
if they will, but if you were to like plot it, it would look like a very, the waveform for those two tapes would look very different.
Yeah,
Is that right?
I mean,
Okay.
if you choose, yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That's a very nice example. Okay, I'm going to very quickly say a little bit about just one neural thing, and then we'll take a break, and then we can chit-chat some more. But I'm very, very happy that this has already become more discussion-based. And I know I said this a little bit last time, and I'm going to just sort of, you know, hammer on that again. You know, turn the internal veto switches down to 0 especially for those of you who haven't said anything yet. I'm completely certain that's not because just like nothing popped into your head, but it's probably because things popped into your head and then got rejected as, you know, unworthy of being emitted into the room. Just you know, get rid of that second part. You know, if it's in your head, just let it fall out of your mouth, and that's completely fine. This is a, you know, and we'll turn off the camera for that bit anyway too. So this is, you know, this is a welcoming atmosphere for that. As you can probably tell, I'm just letting stuff fall out of my mouth. So, you know, please, you know, everyone do that too. Okay, so so what does this have to do with anything brain related? And okay, so there's these things called formants. There's these things that people kind of divide the world up into categories, and they're sensitive to, you know, some category boundaries and not to others, depending upon what language you speak and various other factors. So you could say that, you know, Japanese speakers just have a really, you know, Japanese speakers have a wonderful representation for speaking Japanese, but they happen to have a kind of, you know, poorly formed representation for hearing the difference between ra and la. Okay, but we actually have a really nice representation for hearing the difference between ra and la. We're sensitive to the thing we need to be sensitive to, but we would probably be terrible for, you know, saying different types of Hindi ta sounds. Right? There's probably similar distinctions in Arabic that, for instance, I probably would be unable to. Sorry, do you speak Arabic?
I
Is
do,
it? Okay, that's
but
what I
I
thought.
can't think of any.
No. Well, you know what? The thing is that actually it would not be obvious to, this is one of the many things about language that's interesting, it's not obvious to a native speaker of a language like what they're even sensitive to, right? Like if I said to you, tell me by introspection, just how do you hear the difference between ra and la, right? You'd be like, I don't know, one sounds like ra and the other one sounds like la. I mean, what do you mean? Right? You're certainly not going to say, well, I kind of like, you know, divide the speech sound up into different frequency bands and I look at what happens to the third one, right? You just wouldn't. And in fact, this is actually one of the things that's kind of, again, you know, like really surprising about just the fact that formants exist, or like these sine wave things, for instance, that, you know, just from introspection, I don't know about you, but I would have no idea that the thing that makes, you know, the sounds in, you know, the thing that makes ba sound like ba and da sound like da is that, you know, something in some circumstances, some sound is coming higher in pitch for, you know, 50 milliseconds at the beginning. You know, that's why this stuff was unknown for a long time. And similarly for other rules of language, we have, by introspection, no idea. You wouldn't even be able to say what they are. In fact, you've probably been asked by people who are trying to learn your language, hey, what is that rule for like where you put the word? You're like, I don't know, right? And you know, it's true for, you know, in English too. And yet we follow these rules perfectly without, almost perfectly without blinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was just going to say the same thing, not just with speech, but even with structure. Like,
Right.
I started learning 4 languages as a kid, so
Oh, yeah?
I had no idea what the differences were. You just learn,
Uh-huh.
you give an exam, you score well, and that's the end of it. You can
Right.
converse with people. But after coming here, and then people keep asking you questions, you start realizing the nuances and how English is different from the other languages
Right.
you've learned. And maybe I wasn't introspective enough as a kid.
Well, no, but actually, it's that just means you're a human being because it's one of the most. So this would go. The jargon term for this is like implicit versus explicit learning. So implicit learning, which is a huge topic in many areas of cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, is that you somehow learn stuff kind of just without trying, and you just sort of pick it up. And wouldn't life be nice if you could learn everything that way, right? But you can't. And what kind of things can you learn that way? How on earth does your brain manage to do that? Why is it so much easier for kids to do it than for us? For instance, these are all very, very open questions. And these are actually kind of also like billion-dollar questions too, if you're interested in that aspect of things. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world, including, many of us right here, right now, who would dearly love to be able to hear distinctions that we can't currently hear because we're trying to learn a language, or would like to be able to speak without a foreign accent, or, stuff like that, okay? And it's really hard to do that, and there's entire industries devoted to trying to help people to do that, and it's still really hard to do that. So if anyone were ever, to find the sort of magic cognitive key, if one exists, probably doesn't, might do, who knows, that actually made that easier, then apart from helping humanity a lot, they'd be able to make, some iPhone app that would sell an awful lot of copies, right? So, so these are very interesting and open questions. Okay, so anyway, so we have great representation. We, meaning native English speakers. Apologies to those who are not, or have great representations for hearing that. So, what can, if anything, can we say about this neurally? Well, it might be interesting to say, can we look at someone's brain and actually figure out, do they have a good representation for learning for doing a particular task, or don't they, and what would that even mean neurally? Okay, so so here's an example. Forget neural for a minute. Here's an example of a good representation or a cartoon example of a good representation or a poor representation for doing a particular task. Okay, so here in Ra versus La, we're perceiving the world in terms of formant space, like what's its third formant and what's its second formant. Okay, but now we're going to instead perceive the world in height-weight space, right, where we take all human beings and we just care about how tall they are and how heavy they are. Okay, and for some types of tasks, this is a great representation. So if your job is to tell the difference between sumo wrestlers and basketball players, dividing everyone up in terms of height and weight is going to be just great. Okay? Now, if you only looked at one of these things, if you only looked at, say, height, you'd kind of do okay, but you wouldn't do that great because, some basketball players are actually not that tall. But if you see someone who's, 5'9", and they weigh, 150 pounds, you're much more likely to be a basketball player than if they're 5'9" and they weigh like 500 pounds. Okay? So the combination of these two things together, really allows you to separate categories. So this would be a good representation for doing that task. If you took the exact same representational space of treating everyone in height-weight space, and you gave them some other task, like, dividing people into whether they're faculty or students, well, faculty probably tend on the whole to be maybe like not as tall, maybe a little heavier than students, but these are overlapping categories, okay? So for this task, this would just not be a very good representation. It wouldn't be a completely terrible representation because you might, do slightly better than chance, but it just wouldn't be very good, okay? Well, that's actually doing two different tasks. Well, how about the same task, but some people can do it, some people cannot? Well, that's where the sort of cross-language type thing is an example. So, that's what it's like with English and Japanese speakers for Ra and La. So this is a sort of abstract representation of sort of Ra-La space. This is not meant to be different places in the head. Okay, it's certainly not the case that there's like a Ra area over here and a La area over here, right? I mean, the neural processing involved in hearing Ra and La is almost certainly very, very strongly related, so it would be a terrible waste of brain tissue to have completely different areas for them, and in fact we don't. They all light up your auditory cortex, they all light up your Wernicke's area and probably your Broca's to some degree as well. So, but there must be some way in which the brains of English speakers, actually do distinguish between these sounds, even if it's not in some spatial way that, is over here or over here. but they're probably in the same area, but there's something neurally different about them. Okay, so this is sort of like your new, and the way in which they would be different is you might have different patterns. Okay, so they might be sitting in the same area, but they might have different patterns. So, for instance, I could, print on a page the letter M, and I could print on top of it the letter W, and they might be sitting on top of each other, but you can still tell that one is M and one is W because they're different patterns, right? Even though they've both got more or less the same amount of ink in them. Okay, so I could have, two brain patterns sitting on top of each other that might both have more or less the same amount of activation in them, but you can tell the difference because they're different patterns. Okay, so here's a sort of cartoon that says, well, presumably at some neural level, if we can find anything in terms of the brain distinguishing between these two stimuli, then that underlies people's behavioral ability to distinguish between them, then somewhere in the brain we ought to be able to find somewhere where the neural patterns for Ra and La look quite different at this pattern level, whereas in Japanese people they should seem much more like overlapping categories. Okay? But spatially they're overlapping all the time anyway. So anyway, together with Impact Lab, together with some other people, I did the study, and we actually, I'll skip some of the details because we need to take a break, but we did actually find something like that. So this x-axis here is a measure of the neural pattern separability. So how distinctly are these things represented neurally, even though they're all kind of sitting on top of each other? And I mean, we can talk about the exact reason for this comparison stuff if you want, but I'll skip that for now. And the y-axis here is people's behavioral ability to actually hear the difference between these two things. Okay, so these red guys up here are the English speakers. So behaviorally, we know already the English people can hear the difference between Ra versus La. So that means they're high on this axis. Is my mouse showing up? Yeah. Okay. But not only are they high on that axis, but they're quite far along to the right on this axis too, meaning that there's a large degree of neural pattern separability as well. So there's a relation between the neural distinctiveness and their behavioral ability to tell them apart. Down here are the Japanese people, and we know that behaviorally they can't really tell these things apart, so they're low down this axis, and it also turns out neurally that there's much less neural difference between them as well. Now, at one level you might think, well, of course that must be true because, obviously if we can behaviorally tell things apart, then our brains must be able to do it because that's what's inside us, and that's a completely true statement. But it doesn't mean, first of all, that this is some difference that we'd actually be able to measure, right? There might be something way too subtle. And second of all, well, there's more questions you can ask about that, but you can say, well, if you do measure that, what does that tell us about the way brain is processing things? We can talk about that more later. But I just want to point out one thing about this is that if you look at this, it's not just that the red cloud is up here and the blue cloud is down here, but also you can sort of tell by eyeballing, and you can actually run a statistical test called partial correlation and actually test it. You can see these clouds, especially the Japanese one, are sort of a little bit stretched out along the axis. Okay? So for instance, there's this one Japanese person who just happens to be particularly good at hearing, still actually worse than any of the English people, but better than any of the other Japanese people. They're quite high up on this axis. They're quite good at hearing the difference between Ra and La. Still not very good, but just, less bad than most Japanese speakers. And it turns out that neurally, in fact, they actually have a greater neural distinctiveness as well. So there's actually a relation not just between groups, but also across individuals of this measure of neural pattern distinctiveness and behavioral discriminability. Now, this still doesn't mean that this is the neural difference that's driving their behavior, right? There's probably tons of things happening in their head, and this is just one of them. But it seems reasonable that this may be part of that pathway, okay, or at least it's suggestive of that.
Where is this question? Sorry.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Well, I've got two-part answer to that. So the first time I did this study, I did like a searchlighty thing, and it turned out to be in auditory cortex, although interestingly it was actually in right auditory cortex, which, given the stuff I was saying earlier about how everything's quite bilateral, is not that unsurprising, but it made it harder to get the paper published, I'll tell you that. But then actually subsequently, I did actually like a brain-wide study where I threw in the entire brain, and it turns out that then you get the same effect.